Welcome to Integrated Rangeland Management. This is Karen. We're going to start the whole discussion about how plants respond to disturbance by understanding plant morphology. What are the parts of the plant that could attribute to how well a plant might respond to fire or to grazing or to some other disturbance such as trampling? So throughout this discussion we'll talk about where growth comes from on plants and how they are likely to respond to disturbance.
Several times throughout this discussion I'm going to refer to three major kinds of meristems. Again, a meristem is, or often called a bud, is an area in the plant that is a concentrated area of small cells that have been created but not expanded, not filled out. So what a meristem really looks like is just a really compact area of really tiny cells. And oftentimes they form swellings in the axils of leaves or at the tip of the stem, and so they're called buds because they have a little bud there. At the very tip of stems, at the tip of tillers, which in grasses are stems, or leaders, which is often the word that's used for stems in shrubs, the very tip of those leaders and tillers is the terminal bud or the apical bud. The axillary bud is located at the axil of the leaf and the stem. So it's at the base of the phytomer. So a phytomer is a leaf and whatever connects that leaf to the shoot or to the stem. And at the base of that is a node, or a meristem. So in the axil of that leaf and stem is the axillary bud. Intercalary buds really are only strong in grasses, but they're very important, and they're located at the base of the leaf, at the base of the sheath, and the base of the internode. And they're what create fairly quick growth after a mowing or grazing. So those are the three kinds of buds that we're going to talk about today. Here's an example, a picture of a forb, and you can see the apical bud is the swelling at the tip of the shoot, and it's what causes the plant to essentially grow up as it moves on and those cells become differentiated and expand. They push the stem up. At the axils of the leaf, in this case the leaf is connected to the stem with a petiole, but at the axil of that leaf and stem is an axillary bud, and again in this drawing you can actually see that swelling. If something happens to the apical bud, that swelling or that axillary bud will become a new stem. It's also important to remember that the shoot is moving up with an apical bud, the root is moving down with an apical meristem. So in the same way that shoots are created, buds are on the roots also to expand roots. Here's an example of a plant that is pressed and where its buds are or its meristems are. This is curly cup gumweed, and in this case it's pretty mature, so the stems have pushed up about as far as they're going to, and then that apical bud has turned into a flower. So that's what happens to buds, apical buds or terminal buds, is as they move forward they turn into the flowers of the plant. The axillary bud is a swelling at the base of the leaf and the sheath, and where I have this red dot on this plant is where that axillary bud has started to expand into a new stem. So that axillary bud has been activated and it's starting to form a new little leader. Again, grasses have intercalary buds. They're not well developed in forbs and woody plants, and that will become clear in a minute. So basically there's no axillary buds, there's no intercalary buds on these plants. In order to understand the location of buds and growth in grasses, you have to understand a little bit about how grasses are put together. Each individual unit of a grass is called a phytomer, and that's the blade, and then the sheath, and the sheath is the part of the leaf that actually expands and curls around the stem. And then what we call the stem in a grass is just a series of internodes. The internodes are hollow, and when they stack together they have those nodes or those swellings. So if you think about a piece of straw, you've got that hollow part, and then every once in a while you have these nodes, kind of knees or ankles of the plant that are solid. So those are the nodes, and then below them are the internodes that we call the stem. Right at the top of the node, at the base of the internode, is the axillary bud. So if there's going to be any new stems that come from grasses, it's going to come from that axillary bud. So that's one phytomer. In the center of this graph you can see what happens if you put all those phytomers and stack them up. They form one grass stem, and that is called a tiller. And then a group of tillers all together is simply called a grass plant. And tillers can be connected with rhizomes or stolons, or they can just form a bunch grass. Okay, so keep those terms in mind. And if you look at a diagram then of a grass, you can see that the apical bud in this case has become the seed head. The axillary bud is at the base of the internode. So again, you've got that internode, and then the node right above the node is where we have the axillary bud. And at the bottom of the graph, you'll see there's a new sheath coming out, and that's probably those two little diagrams there are examples of axillary buds that have been activated and starting new tillers. Another way to start new tillers is through rhizomes and stolons. They are just modified stems. Rhizomes are under the ground, stolons are above the ground. But what happens with those is they move out laterally from the grass plant, and then they start new plants. And they too have axillary buds that create those new plants. Anytime a plant is moving and some cells on the stem start to form new plants, we often call that adventitious. So there's a lot of adventitious meristems that are along the stem of a plant. And if a plant is damaged, oftentimes they will start to grow a new plant. I see in this diagram the stem of the plant is called the culm. I may use that word once in a while, so that a whole stem of a whole tiller of a plant is often called the culm, the stem. Here's another little bit of a look at that grass, and this is a look at both culmless, or grasses that are quite young and they have not started to form a stem yet, or culmed. In other words, grasses where that internodes and nodes have started to telescope up and form a stem. They're basically a series of phytomers all stacked up, but the difference is that in the plant on the left, the culmless one, those internodes are really compressed, so you have one little leaf on top of another little leaf on top of another little leaf, and you really don't have much of a stem. And you might find that this spring, if you go out and you get in the grass and you start trying to take those leaves and trying to find the stem, you'll keep pulling back leaves and you'll find sheaths, but you won't find those nodes or the internodes. You won't find the stem till you get way down to the ground. On the other hand, when you've got a very mature grass and you start to grab those leaves, as you pull them apart, you'll see the stem is emerged. So in the culmless situation, the culm has not expanded, or the stem has not expanded. It makes a lot of difference because it really determines how the plant responds to disturbance. Because in the case of a culmless plant, the apical meristem is at the base of the plant. In the culmed plant, the apical meristem is at the tip. I mentioned earlier, and I'm just going to show this diagram now, is how what that apical bud is. In these first two left diagrams, it's a fairly young plant, and if you start curling away those stems, you can really see that the stem part of the plant, the internodes and nodes, are really just this crunched up little piece of growth at the very base, and only just really young leaves are sticking up. On the other hand, when the stem starts to expand up, and that meristem, the apical meristem, starts to expand up, then if you pull away the stems, you'll see a fully created culm of nodes and internodes, and at the very tip of that is the axillary bud. So you can see where at the very tip of that is the apical bud, so you can see where the apical bud is, it's vulnerable to be removed. Here's a picture of a plant that's in that culmless state. So this is a young grass, and there's kind of a red band there. Those swellings where the grass stem is starting to look a little stronger, that's where you would see the actual apical meristem is way down at that red area, and you can kind of see some swelling right below that red band. So all of that material above that red band, then it's just sheaths and leaves. There's really no meristems per se, at least no axillary buds in that material above that red band. Here's another drawing just to kind of help bring this point through. When you got a really young grass, you can see where there's those leaves, the leaf blade. There are, of course, there are intercalary meristems at the base of that leaf, and then you'll see the sheath surrounding sheath upon sheath upon sheath with very little stem. At the very, very base, you see an apical meristem, and below that apical meristem is where you have a stem. You know, at this point, it's just a smudged together group of nodes that really haven't formed what we think of as a stem. Also on this diagram on the right, you'll see this emerging tiller, and you see a little black line growing up, and that would be just a new tiller, a new grass that is a new grass stem that is coming up inside, so this is going to form a little bunch grass with a couple of stems right next to each other. The bottom of the diagram, it points to adventitious roots, and again, adventitious is just a term for groups of cells in the stem that tend to grow and sort of form new areas of growth, new stems, new roots. Now let's talk a little bit about those intercalary meristems. I haven't mentioned them too much. We have the apical meristem at the tip, we have the axillary meristems in the joints of the leaves and the stems. In grasses, we have another kind of meristem called intercalary. They're at the base of the leaf, the base of the sheath, and the base of the internode. So you can see those 3 points on this phytomer where those intercalary meristems are. They're responsible for growth or expansion of leaf sheaths and internodes. That can be really important in a short time scale, not so important in the long time scale. But here's how it works. If you had a plant that was in that culmless situation, so the apical meristem is way at the base of the plant, and you come along and you nip it off with a mower or a cow or a sheep or a deer, nips it off. Really quite quickly you'll start to see that stem kind of telescope up. And in the case of mowing your yard, you've probably seen this. You mow it one day, it looks all nice, clean, crisp, all level, and surely by the next day you've already got these, it's starting to look ragged. And what's looking ragged is the middle of those the grass stem are sheaths that are expanding out. That expansion is caused by intercalary meristems, or meristems that are at the base of those sheaths in this case. So you can have really quick response from intercalary meristems. In the long scheme of things, they don't contribute an incredible amount to growth. Here's a diagram that tries to explain where growth comes from in grasses, and that varies by rate. So on the way left is a description of what I just said. There's really quick response, growth response after defoliation. But the amount of biomass that can actually be created by intercalary meristems is not very much, because all that's happening when intercalary meristems are activated is they just have cell elongation. The cells are already formed, they're just filling them out, they're just elongating. Apical meristems are somewhere in the middle. The growth rate is relatively quick if the apical meristem is intact when biomass is lost. And the apical meristem has the ability to not only just elongate cells, but it can create new cells and differentiate cells. So it can take cells that exist, divide them to create new ones, and cause differentiation. So you can have more growth because now the apical meristem has the ability to really create a new set of cells. And if it's left intact, it can contribute quite a bit to biomass. That arrow that goes back to axillary buds over to the right there, from apical to axillary buds, shows that within weeks that apical meristem can start to form new buds or axillary buds. So not only can it form new leaf and stem cells, it can also form new buds. And those axillary buds are important because they're the ones that will create new stems. If you have a new stem that's created, an axillary bud is converted into an apical bud. So bottom line, apical buds can respond fairly quickly, and they can turn into axillary buds, which in the long scheme of things can contribute to a lot of biomass because they're going to create new stems or expand new stems. But it takes quite a while. So on the very right hand side, you have contribution to growth or to biomass, which is quite high, but actual time it takes is quite a long time, weeks. And I keep saying this over and over again, hoping that these terms, apical, axillary, intercalary, will make sense. As we're talking about apical, this term apical dominance might be a familiar term if you took chemistry, if you took botany or plant physiology at some point in your career. Apical dominance is this idea that that apical stem has control over all the axillary buds. So the apical meristem releases hormones, and it keeps hold of resources so that it can keep axillary buds in a dormant state. So the apical bud has this advantage of being able to create new buds and really keep them at bay or keep them from expanding. That idea is called apical dominance. Way back when I was in school, it was believed that apical dominance was completely a hormonal control effect. So there were auxins that the apical bud released, and they suppressed the axillary. Suppressed the axillary buds. Yeah, axillary. But now we realize that it's not just hormones, that's a part of it, but probably a more important fact is that when that apical bud is growing, it's using most of the resources of the plant. So what it's doing is just really using the resources so that those axillary buds cannot become differentiated and cannot start growing. And that's why oftentimes we'll see a plant that's growing up really strongly, and then towards the bottom of the plant, towards the ground, those axillary buds will start to expand, because the effect of the apical meristem kind of has a lower effect just because they're a long ways away from the apical meristem. So one of the main points here is that our knowledge of what's going on in plants has changed since I was in school, and I'm afraid that there's probably quite a few things that I'm saying in this lecture and throughout this class that are wrong. Someday we'll find out they're wrong, so it's really important that you keep learning and keep asking if this makes sense or not. This idea of apical dominance is, however, important. If you remove that apical meristem, the axillary buds can be activated and form new tillers and leaders. So again, tillers and grasses, leaders and shrubs and forbs, new stems. The axillary buds then turn into apical buds, so they then start to have dominance over axillary buds that are below them in the stem. After defoliation, then, the growth of intercalary meristems can be quite rapid, but the growth from the axillary and the apical buds, though it's slower, is really much more important in terms of how it leads to more growth in the plant. The point that's important to remember is that in shrubs and forbs, in this case on the left there's chokecherry and on the right is a forb curly-cup gumweed, the point of growth is at the tip of the stem. So the newest cells are at the tip of the stem. And you think about what can happen to those new cells that are trying to expand and move out. If you look at that chokecherry, that new growth that's going to create new stems and new leaves is right at the tip, easy for an animal or for a fire or for an insect or a large grazing animal to remove. So it's really dangerous. The plant has very few ways to save that meristem. Think about what are some of the ways that the plant could protect that meristem. It's way out at the tip of the branches, available to be disturbed by fire and grazing. How could it protect that meristem? One way is with thorns. Neither of these plants have thorns, but many plants do, and that's really an important mechanism to try to save or protect meristems. Another is chemical. Both of these plants have chemical defenses that reduce their herbivory. Sometimes just having a large group of leaves or woody material around the meristem can also be effective. Some plants, like the large acacia trees in the savannas, actually grow very quickly, and they move the new growth out of reach of fire and herbivores. So those big high trees that giraffes eat, most herbivores can't reach. So those are the main ways that a plant protects its meristems. And I'm sorry, when I say a plant, in this case I mean shrubs and forbs protect their meristems. The location of growing points in forbs and shrubs, the growth is initiated at the tip of the stem. So in this example, the tips are all cut off, but the tips are expanding outwards from the axillary buds, and then the buds at the base of these stems, along the stem, at the base of the leaves along the stem, are the axillary buds, and they're the next ones that will be activated to create growth. Here's an example, an actual plant that was in the herbarium, and it shows what happens if you remove that apical meristem. So I'm pointing to an apical meristem that, in this case, is kind of shrinking up because it was removed, and those other three branches right below it are being activated, and they're starting, they've been growing for a little while, and they're starting to get pretty thick, and they're becoming the main stems. You don't see on the left-hand side this kind of a crooked stem. What probably happened there is that meristem was also removed, and that younger growth that's coming off and down to the left is a new tiller that is a result of an axillary bud that was activated. So the plant is growing along, and anytime that apical bud is removed, the plant starts to put out secondary, it starts to activate secondary or axillary meristems and create new stems. This is what causes hedging in shrubs. So if you go along and you take off all those apical meristems, several secondary stems will be, the axillary meristems will be activated, and secondary stems will start to grow and create a hedging. And you can see that's pretty clear in this plant. Grasses are quite different though. Remember, grasses are growing from the base and they're telescoping up. So in that top drawing, the growing point or the meristems of the plant are pretty low. And if you come along, if an animal or fire comes along and removes that top, the growing points remain intact. And then that top just keeps telescoping up, and the newest growth is at the base of the plant. So the regrowth on the right-hand side of that top diagram is actually coming from the base, and the newest growth is at the base and pushing the old growth up. So it's a pretty effective way to keep meristems protected from herbivory, and one of the big differences is that the oldest growth is at the tip of these stems, which is the opposite of forbs and shrubs. If those growing points have been elevated, such as the diagram in the bottom, when you have these elongated tillers, you can see that dotted line where the growing points are. Then, if those are removed, that stops growth of that tiller. That tiller can't go on anymore, and axillary buds have to be activated at the base. So you start to see some basal buds there starting to grow, and then the regrowth is going to have to come in the form of new tillers that are being started or starting to grow from the base of the plant. So it's slower, it takes more energy, and that's why we're always trying to make sure that we are using grazing or understanding the role that fire and grazing have on removing apical buds. Just one point about stolons and rhizomes, that they're actually modified stems, so they have the same kinds of apical and axillary buds. They have one huge advantage when it comes to fire and grazing, and that is that they're hard to damage because they are at the ground surface or below. So they're very hard for herbivores to remove those buds, and even fire can go through a plant and not really have much of an effect on those buds unless it's really hot and really dry. Or really moist. Sometimes having moisture in the soil can increase the temperature. Sometimes if it's cool fire and it goes through a system, there can be an evaporative effect, and the soil can be largely unaffected. So depending on the intensity of the fire, those meristems at the base can stay pretty unaffected, pretty intact. In the case of grazing animals, large grazing animals have a very hard time removing these nodes. So the key is, in order to determine how a plant is going to respond to grazing or fire, it's important to think about the location of growing points. That depends on season. Early in the season for grasses, they have their meristems close to the ground and protected. As the season progresses, they elevate them and then they become subject to removal. Some grasses are better at this than others. Some grasses keep their meristems close to the ground for a long, long time. Others elevate them quite quickly. So the kind of plant determines this also. Intercalary meristems, again, to cap off, they are very important. They are distinct in grasses. They are the region at the internode, sheath, and blade that produce new cells and leaf expansion. That's where we see the really quick growth right after disturbance. But in the long run, they're really not that important. So they're really kind of immaterial from a management perspective, except that they can really provide that growth over the after initial disturbance, and then provide opportunities for photosynthesis. Meristems and dicots, then, I guess in just summary, forbs and shrubs have apical, axillary buds, not intercalary buds. And then they also have other kinds of buds that you'll hear terms are lateral buds, which are ones that really expand growth out, like in the case of roots or stems like stolons and rhizomes. Sometimes they can have a mixture of lateral and axillary buds, or the kinds of buds that create thorns would also be in that group of mixed buds. And flowers. Some buds, their only role is really to produce a flower. And then that term adventitious is just that these growing points arise from some point along the root or the stem, and they really don't have a big connection to the apical meristem. They're just meristems that are in the shoot or the root of a plant, and they form growth that expands out. Apical meristems are all important. We've talked about this before, but when you're managing, it's really important to pay attention to where the apical meristems are and how likely they are to be removed. Plants that have been disturbed will often tend to keep their meristems closer to the base or the center of the plant, and we have what we call a long shoot and short shoot response. On the left is a mesquite plant that probably hasn't had much disturbance, hasn't had fire or grazing animals come through, so you see there's really kind of long internodes between those petioles, and the plant looks to be fairly undisturbed. On the right hand side is a short shoot growth plant, so the plant has apparently been disturbed. Could be by insects or could be by fire, and what happens is the plant tends to just put very short internodes on and keep that meristem closer to the center of the plant or the ground. So with that, think about what determines how a plant regrows after disturbance. What determines how quickly the plant will respond and how well it will respond? A couple of points you might think about. One is how it depends on how intense the disturbance is, how much biomass is removed, or how hot the fire is, and how much of the leaves are removed. You can determine on the plant, just by the plant. Some plants keep their meristem lower to the ground, and they're just really able to protect meristems, and they also have a lot of meristems. So how well a plant responds to disturbance does depend on how many meristems it has left after the disturbance. It does certainly depend on whether that apical meristem was removed, because if it was removed, the plant has to start by differentiating axillary buds. It also depends on whether moisture is available. If moisture is available in the environment, the plant can respond quite well. So it depends on when the herbivory or fire occurs. Those would be the main factors: when, how much, and where the disturbance occurs affects whether a plant is going to recover or not. And as we go through this class, we'll keep learning more and more about that, and hopefully you'll be able to look at a plant and have a sense of how likely it is to be really damaged by grazing or fire.